We're starting a new series today on the Patriarchs. We're going to spend the next several weeks looking at the stories from the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, even though Joseph isn't considered one of the patriarchs. I think like 13 chapters at the end of Genesis are devoted to the life of Joseph, so we're going to spend some time looking at him as well and his life. And most of you probably realize this, but Genesis, the very first book in the Bible, is about beginnings, right? The first part is about the beginning of the world, the beginning of creation, the beginning of the cosmos, and we looked at that, I don't know, I think it's been probably 3 years ago at this point. And now part 2 of Genesis is all about the beginning of God's chosen people, the people of Israel, the family of blessing. Grace just read about that. The family of blessing and the conduit of blessing to the nations, to the rest of the world. Now, the subtitle of this series is God's Relentless Pursuit. God's Relentless Pursuit. Our focus in this series is going to be on God. This is first and foremost about Him. This is His story. So what do we learn about God? What do we learn about His ways? What do we learn about His character? What do we learn about His purposes? Those are some of the things we're going to be learning about. And today is just going to be a brief introduction to the series. And I want to highlight three things that we're going to learn about God throughout this series. Now, obviously, we're going to learn more lessons. We're going to learn other things about God. But these are the three main things that I want to highlight today. And the first one is this. We're going to come face to face in this series with God's patience. God's patience. Now, many of us grew up going to Sunday school, hearing the Bible stories, having our children's Bibles, learning all the Bible stories and the characters, in the Bible. How many of you did? How many of you grew up in the church and attended children's vacation Bible school? And so you were taught all these, you had your children's Bibles, you learned all these stories, and that's awesome and that's great. I'm the same way. But if you think about it, if you really think about it, many of the stories in the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, are not fit for kids. I mean, they're not fit. I mean, they're like R-rated, maybe worse. They're not really fit for kids. And so the way we grew up being taught the Bible, we would open it up to wherever, and we'd read about this character, and we would pull out a moral lesson from his or her life, and what do we learn, and we would learn these great stories, and like I said, there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But the main thing we learned from these patriarchs, and actually most of the people in the Old Testament, is that they were pretty screwed up. They were messed up. I mean, they were highly dysfunctional. They had highly dysfunctional families. Really, really, really. Now, there are some exceptions. We'll talk about those during this series. But for the most part, these are not characters to be emulated. Not a lot of positive lessons to be learned here. Now, even with Abraham, who is known as a great man of faith, and the scriptures talk about his great faith, and he was a man of faith. We'll talk about that as well. We'll learn about that. Even for him, it probably took him a while. It probably took him a while to come to grips that there was just one God. Just one God. I mean, we read the passage that Grace read. God told Abraham to go, and then Abraham left, and we think, wow, what great faith. No, it probably took him a while. To understand that there's just one God, just one God. There was a foreign idea to him. And this one God was asking him to leave all his other gods behind, leave his home, leave his homeland, leave his family, go somewhere where this strange God is leading him, to do something through him that maybe he just wasn't too sure about at the time. Abram probably wasn't... He didn't have strong faith right immediately, right from the get-go. He had to grow in his faith. In Joshua, Joshua is talking to the people of Israel, reminding them of their story, reminding them of their history. It says, Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshiped other gods." This was their reality. They worshiped other gods. "But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants." God chose a pagan man from a pagan family in the midst of a pagan culture. And we're going to talk more about this next week. And all of this highlights God's tremendous patience with humanity. Now, I mentioned this last week if you were here, but God, from the very beginning, has decided to partner with human beings to accomplish his purposes in the world. That's what he's done, and that's what he's desired, to partner with human beings to accomplish his purposes. It's always been the case, and I will never understand why he's chosen to do that. God didn't have to create human beings. He didn't have to create us. He especially didn't have to create us in his image and allow us to partner with him. He didn't have to do any of this, but he did. God is extremely patient. God's extremely patient with human beings. He's extremely patient with me, I know that. We'll see that throughout this series. Number two, we're gonna see throughout this series over and over what God's revelation is all about. God's revelation. In the pagan culture of Abraham's day, there were not many atheists. It was kind of unheard of to be an atheist because, people back in that day, almost everybody would look around and come to some kind of conclusion that there's got to be, something or someone transcendent above it all doing something in this world. And in most cases, it was plural, like some things or some ones involved, in this world, wreaking havoc and causing chaos in the world and causing chaos in people's lives, toying with human beings for their pleasure. That's what they had in mind about the gods back in that ancient culture. People could only guess what pleased the gods. People could only guess what made the gods angry. They could only make guesses as to what these gods were up to in the world, what these gods were like. But the one true God, the one who created it all, the creator of the universe, he wants to be known. He absolutely wants to be known, and he revealed himself to Abraham and his family. And then through the people of Israel to the rest of the world. That was the goal. To Abraham and his family, and then to reveal himself to the rest of the world through the law and through the prophets and through the other writings of the Jewish scriptures that we call the Old Testament today. Which, and this is what I believe, we probably wouldn't have any of that if it wasn't for Jesus. Because Jesus came along, and Jesus taught that he was the fulfillment, the culmination of all the Jewish scriptures. Jesus claimed that all of that pointed to him. And we mentioned this before. Then he died. And that was that, right? He died, and that was the end of the story. I mean, the disciples fled. The disciples were scared. The Jesus movement, that Jesus thing was over. He was just a so-called Messiah, just another one who claimed to be Messiah. He claimed to be the king, but he wasn't. He was dead. It was over. It was over. They weren't going to write any of this stuff down. They weren't going to record any of it. There was no need to. Just another Messiah, a fake Messiah, a false Messiah, and he was dead. But it's only because he came back to life 3 days later that we even have any of this stuff recorded. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the other New Testament letters, you see, when they saw him die, they witnessed him die, and then they witnessed him back to life again 3 days later. They had lunch with him, they walked with him, they talked with him, they spent time with him. When they saw that, they witnessed that, that highlighted everything that Jesus did. It put an exclamation point on everything that Jesus said about himself. And they said, we've better record this stuff. We better write this stuff down. He is who he said he is. He is the king. He is the Messiah. And he is the fulfillment of this big story of ours that we find in the scriptures. Now, maybe you'll remember this after the crucifixion and the resurrection when, Jesus appeared to the two guys who were walking to Emmaus. Maybe you've heard that story. It's in Luke chapter 24, but these men are walking to Emmaus. They're leaving Jerusalem. They're upset. Jesus just died. They thought Jesus was going to be the Messiah. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. He's surely not the Messiah. He's dead. But then, the women, saw the tomb empty, and they're wrestling with this, and how could this be? And they're not sure about it. They're walking to Emmaus, and then Jesus appears next to them. They don't realize it's him, and he begins talking to them, and he begins teaching them, and we read these amazing words in Luke chapter 24, verse 7. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, the law, the prophets, the Jewish scriptures, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. He said, this is all about me. All the scriptures that you've grown up with, it's about me. And if you read closely, you'll see that this is the way it had to be. I was going to die. I was supposed to die and then raise again 3 days later. This is about me. And so later on then, the Old Testament and the New Testament were bound together in what we call the Bible today, all because God chose to reveal himself to Abram and his pagan family. How incredible is that? And then through him to the rest of the world, culminating in the revelation of God through his son Jesus. And once again, God didn't have to make himself known to human beings, right? He didn't have to make himself known, but he did. Because he's a relational God. He's a covenantal God. He wants to be known. He desires a loving relationship, a partnership with humanity. He always has, he always will. That's the kind of God he is. And we don't have to guess what our Creator is like. We know about his character. We know about his heart. We know how he works in the world. We know what he's up to. We know his plans and his purposes. And this is the main way we know and understand his character, his heart, his plans, his ways. This is the main way. And this is not just a story to know about. It's not just a story to learn. This is a story to embody. As followers of Jesus, we're a part of this. We're a part of this. We get to participate in what God is up to in the world, and we'll talk more about that. We'll learn more about that throughout this series. Finally, we're going to be confronted throughout this series with God's plan, with God's purposes. And we get a picture of God's plan, God's purpose, once again in the very beginning, and I think almost on a weekly basis we read these verses. It's hard for me to read any part of the scriptures and not be thinking of the beginning and what the whole thing is about and how it all was set up. Genesis 1:27, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds of the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Humanity was created in the image of God, created to partner with the Creator, to rule on God's behalf as his representatives and to reflect his glory to the rest of creation. The purpose, we talked about that a little bit last week as well. And God's blessing was that they be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, reproducing and growing and spreading, a multiplication of image bearers who fill the earth and reflect God's glory. That was God's plan. That was God's purpose for humanity and for his creation. A beautiful picture. But of course, once again, we talk about this almost on a weekly basis. Instead of ruling on God's behalf, reflecting his glory, they make it about themselves. They decide to rule on their own terms. And instead of trusting their creator, they decide that they know what's best. And isn't that what humanity's like, right? We know what's best. We don't need God. And so they forfeited the blessing. They forfeited the blessing. And last week we talked about how they just made a gigantic mess of things. That's what humanity has done. That's what we have done. We made a gigantic mess of things, of our lives and the world around us. However, while humanity failed, God said, no problem. No problem. My plan, my purposes will continue. My plan, my purposes will be accomplished. And so in Genesis chapter 3, we read about God's promise to make things right again through the seed, the offspring of Eve. And the rest of the story is about how God was going to bring that about. How God was going to bring his blessing back to humanity through this seed, through this offspring. And we're wondering, how is it going to be accomplished? It's a story about how he's going to redeem his people in all of creation. How is this going to be accomplished? And then later on in Genesis, which is where we're at in this series, we see that it's through the seed of this particular woman named Sarai, Abram's wife. And their family, their offspring. This is to be the family of blessing. The family of blessing. Now, we usually highlight Genesis chapter 12, the beginning of Genesis chapter 12, which Grace read earlier for us. That's really important. We'll actually dig into that next week. Let me just read it again. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Really, really important. But this morning, and for the start of this series, I really wanted to highlight the previous verses in the previous chapter. The chapter 11 and the genealogy, and Grace only read part of it. And we usually skip over that because that's the boring part, right? That's the boring part. Let's read it again because it's really important. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram and Nahor and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in the Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Uh-oh. We've got a problem here, right? Not able to conceive, not able to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. How can this be the family of blessing? God's plan needs a seed. God's plan needs offspring. This verse here is included for a very, very important reason. It should stand out to us. This verse sets the stage. Sets the stage for what's to come. It sets us up to put the focus where the focus belongs. You see, this is God's story. It's God's story. This is first and foremost about him. This is about his plans and his purposes. You may think there's a problem. From a human perspective, this seems impossible, but he's the creator. He's the creator that just spoke the world into existence. Not a problem for him. Not a problem for him. God's purpose, God's plan of redemption will be accomplished. It cannot be stopped, no matter what. And Job reminds us of this. I love this. I love this verse in Job. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You're God. You're the God of the universe. You spoke the world into existence. None of your plans, none of your purposes can be thwarted. You're a big God. I was also reminded of this past week. I'm a part of a team for our denomination that does interviews for pastors who are wanting to be ordained in our denomination. They want to receive a pastor's license, or they're seeking ordination. And so me and usually 2 or 3 other guys from our denomination will interview these candidates. And so during this past week, we interviewed a couple candidates. And I was reminded as they began to tell their stories. One man in particular talked about how at his previous position he was falsely accused. And it was a horrible time for he and his family. And he was let go. It was devastating to his family. God, why are you doing this? They didn't understand what was happening. He said he can now look back and he can see how God's hand was a part of that, how God was leading him. A huge obstacle. It seemed like a huge obstacle to him. It seemed overwhelming to him and his family at the time. Not a problem for God. God's plan, his purposes always prevail. Another guy we talked to, he said that he grew up in a family. They didn't attend church. His mom and dad were divorced at a young age, and he said it was just kind of a difficult situation. But he when he was with his grandma would take him to church. And so then when he was in middle school, his mom decided to take him to church too, but she didn't want to go, and she's just like, well, she didn't want to look bad because grandma was taking him to church, and so she said, she better take him to church as well. Just terrible motives, right? Taking him to church for the wrong reason, terrible example, not an ideal family situation, an obstacle, right? An obstacle, not a problem for God. He's a pastor today. He's leading a growing congregation. God's purposes always prevail. So throughout this series, we're going to see sin, disobedience, deceit, deception, evil intentions, misguided motives, stories of flawed human beings over and over and over again, failing over and over again. Not a problem for God. We're going to see difficult circumstances. We're going to see childlessness. We're going to see famine and oppression, various obstacles of all kinds in the way of these patriarchs and their families, in the way of the people of Israel. Not a problem for God. This is God's story. He has a plan. He has a purpose for his creation. And humanity is invited. We are invited. You are invited to participate in it. You may forfeit the blessing. You may miss out. Decide you don't want to be a part of it. We can refuse that. We can refuse to participate. But God's plan, God's purposes will always prevail. And these are just some of the things that we're going to learn throughout this series. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up now, and we're going to spend some time just reflecting. We're going to spend some time in prayer, and then we'll do some more singing and worshiping. How are you being challenged this morning? Will you bow your heads and let's just spend some moments reflecting and praying together. I'll lead you as you begin reflecting. Think about God's patience in your life. What does God's patience look like in your life? How do you see God's patience in your life? And thank him for it. If the Bible is God's revelation to us, the main way we know him, the main way we know his ways through Jesus, are you spending time in it? Are you growing in your walk? Are you growing in faith? Are you trusting him more and more? And how might God be calling you to participate in his plan, in his purposes in this world? How are you challenged to participate in his big story of redemption for humanity in his world?